Hello, everyone, and welcome to That 90s Witch. I am Trace, and I am so excited to introduce you to Heather Greene. Heather Greene is a religion journalist, the award-winning author of Lights, Camera, Witchcraft, A History of Witches in American Film and Television, a historian with a master's in film studies from Emory University, a proud member of the Covenant of the Goddess, Circle Sanctuary, and the Religion Newswriters Association. And she is a current acquisitions consultant for Llewellyn Worldwide. Heather has stood and studied at the crossroads of pop culture, history, politics, religion, art, film, and the occult for over 30 years, and no one can make her stop. Welcome, Heather Greene, to That 90s Witch.
Wow, thank you very much. I'm so happy to be talking about this topic today with you.
I know, I am so excited. As a 90s witch myself and as a young person in the 90s discovering witchcraft, becoming a witch, and I'm sure this is true for almost everybody, and even now, media depictions of witches were so important to me when I was younger. And especially in the 90s, it was in some ways the only sort of witch representation I could get my hands on, especially when I was younger, before I knew that there was a shelf in the library about the Salem witch trials and historic witchcraft and stuff like that. But certainly no practical books. And so, I just absorbed as much of that media as I possibly could. And I think it really shaped not only me and my practice, but witchcraft as a whole, especially in the United States in that decade. What do you think about that?
I think that's absolutely true. The 90s is probably one of the most interesting decades that I look at in my book because of the vast change from 1990 to 1999 in the representation of witchcraft. So it's such an interesting decade, and it's such a watershed decade for modern witchcraft as well, taking it from out of the satanic panic into a place of religious recognition. So the 90s is a major decade for in so many ways in terms of witchcraft representation and witchcraft practice.
Absolutely. I was having a conversation with another one of my friends talking about how I was going to be speaking with you about this. And one of the things that occurred to me is one of the biggest shifts that I noticed. And it was right around when I discovered real witchcraft and was starting to practice in my own bedroom. But one of the things I really noticed is that even in the beginning of the 90s in film and television, that the image of the witch shifted from this purely supernatural creature or this purely other creature or something that you had to come from another world to be, into being, well, this is something you could be. This is what your neighbors are. This is what you could choose to be this. You could just simply choose to be this. And it wasn't just a depiction of evil, which I don't always think it was in the past or either necessarily. It was complicated, but that was the biggest shift that I really felt and noticed, is that it went from purely out there supernatural creature or maybe even misunderstood outsider into being a real person who was also a real witch.
Mhm. Yeah, you have a very interesting thing because of the early part of the 90s was dead center for Hollywood and for television of the Satanic Panic. So even though the panic had been going on for 8 to 10 years by that point, Hollywood didn't start to reflect those kind of things until the late 80s, 87,
Mm,
88. So really the 90s, we get a lot of Satanic Panic witch movies in the early part of it. And most of those witches are either I've joined a satanic coven and I'm evil.
mhm.
I want to eat children. They're fantasy witches like Hocus Pocus, still wanting to harm children. There's a totally a different tenor in the representation of those, even if they're not wholly evil, like the witches of Eastwick.
Yes.
There's still this connection to evil Satanism, to the devil in Christian terms, and all that stuff. So you get that. And then by the 1996, which is the banner year, and we can get into that, but 1996 is almost a complete flip-flop. You go
Absolutely.
from that to witchcraft representations embodying what I call the You Go Girl movement, 3rd wave
Mhm.
feminism, that came out of things like the Spice Girls and some other movements that were very much feminist movements of the young teens. You get Charmed, you get The Craft in partly The Craft, which is sort of a bridge movie, and you get Buffy the Vampire Slayer's representations, and as I said, Charmed and Practical Magic. Again, you said Next Door. That's the Next Door girl, or the Witch Next Door movie, right?
Hmm.
So you get this really, really interesting, almost entire flip-flop. And then out of that comes slowly this understanding that Wicca specifically, and we can talk about that, is actually a religion and not an evil practice. And that comes directly out of all of this,
Yes.
along with along with lots of other things, but not just this. But yet that comes out of this whole period as well. It's a complete, you were picking up on exactly what was happening. It was a flip-flop unlike any other in any other decade.
Yeah, I've said in a few of these episodes now that it was the decade that changed everything, especially when it came to witchcraft and representation. It changed everything. And so you had mentioned that The Craft was a bridge movie, and I kind of want to talk a little bit more about that because I totally agree with you. And from your knowledge, was that the first movie that first of all kind of like spoke a little bit to that satanic panic fear of witches, but then had an actual Wiccan witch consultant and included actual Wiccan witchcraft elements in that movie? Was it the first movie that bridged all of those things? Like it didn't just bridge from like, oh, this isn't so scary, but it literally bridged from, oh, this is Satanism to, oh, this is a religion and it's still a little dark and it's still a little edgy, but it's not just taking it from evil and scary to good and light. It's really taking it from one ideology to another. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, yeah. And I think The Craft, I call it a bridge movie because it starts out with the positive. Um, you see very much stuff that could be reflected even in movies today where girls that were harmed and different and othered in a number of different ways move to witchcraft to empower themselves. And that's something, that's a theme that's very popular in the 2010s, more so than the 90s.
Yeah.
And and you have, yes, this is the first movie where we have the known um involvement of a Wiccan priestess. And I say that carefully because Raymond Buckland and other practitioners did consult in the 70s, and there's and
Mhm.
in the early 80s we have some evidence of it, but that those movies were not represent or not truly representative of Wicca as a practice. They were more consulting on movies that were not that were more satanic based or just movie witchcraft stuff. There was some stuff you could see through the 70s. This is the first time you actually see something where a Wiccan practitioner looks at the screen and goes, I know that. It feels right. And I know that so many people said that. That's why it's such a popular movie in the pagan and witchcraft community, because that scene with the butterflies, the language, everything. But then as a bridge movie, it goes dark and
Yeah.
it starts to do what the 90s does to witchcraft. It differentiates between Wicca, and I'm specifically using the word Wicca here, Wicca as a religious spiritual movement and practice is good, but witchcraft as a craft and practice is evil. And that's the dichotomy you get starting to separate in the 90s. And the craft is doing that in its own way. So that's why I call it a bridge movie, because that second half where Nancy goes a little off the wall,
Hmm.
that is a tribute, that is definitely coming from the remainders of the satanic panic, this idea of this darker, deeper, separate from the good girl witch, the natural witch, the Wiccan ceremony, the butterflies. Now we're going dark. So there's still a dark element that we need to save our teenagers from. You still have that
Hmm.
in there. And it's linked to the girl with the dark hair, to the girl that looks more goth. So you still have you still have those pieces of the Satanic Panic in the craft. Um, but it has a more positive ending. It has the beginning stuff. So it's a bridge movie. It has a little bit of the Satanic Panic still left in it, but it really gives the opportunity for people to see Wicca and witchcraft as something other than the experience we have with Nancy. Now, Nancy wasn't worshiping Satan. She was worshiping another male god that was made up for the movie, but that's what it's representative of.
Specifically for, I always thought that that was really amusing too, because you had mentioned that it feels right to practitioners, that movie, and why it was
Mhm.
such a hit. And I was already had discovered real witchcraft and had started practicing probably a year or two even before then. And so when I saw it on the silver screen, I practically had vertigo. These things that were like I was hiding, that were secret. My parents didn't know. I had to ride my bike across town to get books and stuff like that, right? And bring it into my house. And now these things that I'm saying and doing and these tools that I have are there on this movie screen. And it was very impactful for me too. I definitely felt that as well. And what I kind of think is interesting about this too is that with Nancy and, still with this bridge movie, still including a little bit of that satanic panic, it's still in such stark contrast to me. And I thought about this when you mentioned the dark hair aspect to the 1990 movie, The Witches with Angelica Houston, right? Where they are truly monstrous, otherworldly beings. And so even though it gets darker in the craft and there's some warning that we have to save our teenagers from, only 6 years before then, witches were still this way, right?
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And I would link her. Yes, you had the witches and the monstrous, and that's a direct fantasy connection to eating kids and the
Yeah.
monsters. Yeah, but the representation of Nancy as this evil witch is more linked to the 80s and 90s, early 90s trend of um girls and women cavorting with the devil and becoming satanic evil witches, and that is more like more aligned with the witches of Eastwick, because you
Yeah.
have those trend, or witchcraft. I don't know if anybody's ever seen the witchcraft series. There's like 14 of them,
Oh
I
yeah,
think.
they're terrible and I love them. Yeah.
Terrible. Well, if you watch the first and second one, especially the second one, no, maybe it was the first, I can't remember. um I think it's the second one where you see that evil. There's a bunch of movies in the late 80s and early 90s where a single either teen or young woman is linked specifically to evil witchcraft. And you see
Mhm.
it also in this kind of differentiation between Wicca and witchcraft comes out first in the X-Files of all places, where you start to see the division. Before it was just witchcraft, witchcraft, witchcraft is evil, it's satanic. That's the 80s. In 90s, you have witchcraft is evil and Wicca is religion and spiritual. And you see it in the X-Files, but Nancy is linked to that other side. She becomes linked to that other side. And it's sad in many ways, but at the same time, the rest of the movie um pulls itself out of that, and so you
Right.
get this dichotomy. And 1996 was also the year that was the very first um cinematic adaptation of The Crucible, and that says a lot.
Oh, right, with Winona Ryder.
Yes, and so
Yes.
that says a lot about 1996. You have this bridge movie that is openly and celebrating the difference, marking the difference, and then celebrating Wicca and showing the difference. So that's the craft. Um, and is highly celebrated amongst, it wasn't world renowned, but it was very popular. And then you have the Crucible, which then is a commentary on moral panic. So it's very interesting that these two films came out in 1996, and then from that point on, the representation of witchcraft is vastly different.
I mean, let's just talk about 1996 for a minute here, because now we've got The Crucible coming out in 1996. We've got The Craft coming out in 1996. We have the
Mhm.
Sabrina the Teenage Witch movie with Melissa Joan Hart and the television series that starts in 1996,
Yep.
right? Like all of these witch things are happening in 1 year. And then immediately after that, we start getting Halloween Town, we get Charmed, we get Practical Magic, we get a whole new world of witchcraft representation. And it literally, that the line is 1996.
It is, and you very rarely can you find a line that strong. And I think it was by 1994, and it took 1994 is when I believe, if I remember correctly, and I have to look back at my book, the date when the authorities started to push back against the satanic panic and the FBI came out and said, no, this is all crap. It was 92 or 96, and I can't remember. So it took, and then a lot of other media folks, Geraldo and stuff, came on and said, no, it was all garbage. So you have this period of time in the early to mid 90s where a lot of big voices are saying the satanic panic was bogus.
Hmm.
So that's not to say that there weren't lingering effects. Of course, there was still, Pokemon was still being banned. Of course, you have Harry Potter coming by the late 90s, and that's banned. And, so you still have the residual effects. It isn't really until the 2000s that that's fully gone. But, or not fully gone. We can't say it's fully gone. That's, that would
Certainly,
be,
no. I want to talk
it's,
to you about that too. But
yeah,
in terms of banning things quite the same way, that stopped in the 2000s. But I
yeah.
would say the Satanic Panic is actually still relevant today. But continue.
Yeah,
Yeah.
we could talk about that for hours, by the 2000s is when it goes to a minimum. We don't have a lot of that stuff going on, but by the 90s you start to have that change. So by 1996, the big voices had spoken. They had pushed back against it. We had the promise of the internet. We had
Mhm.
a fairly stable and easy decade politically and economically, stable presidency compared to what we're seeing today. So the 90s, really by the 96, we really had a stable world. And on
Yeah.
top of that, it allowed girls, by 1996, it allowed for this third wave feminism, which is often overlooked because it's really based in that sort of, like I said, the Spice Girls kind of, you go girl, we did our thing, we're here now, and we can do anything, and we can even do witchcraft. And the only unfortunate part of that is that the media representation of witches, the only problem is most of them were upper middle class, very good looking white girls. So you have a
Hmm.
little bit of a spin there, the criticism on what that means and how that looks more globally. But yes, 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 we have a big change.
Big change. And I kind of want to connect what we're talking about here with 1996 and this big change to and the Satanic Panic
Mhm.
to today even, right? Because what are your thoughts about Sabrina the Teenage Witch 1996 coming out with Melissa Joan Hart? And now we're here with the chilling adventures of Sabrina, and they're full on satanic witches. And that's a more representational today, maybe just more popular, more allowed, less banned, these sorts of things. But what do you think about that leap, that jump, or that juxtaposition?
I love this question because I love Sabrina, and Sabrina doesn't get enough conversation in the witch representation world because Sabrina, which you may know, actually began in the early 60s
Hmm.
in comics.
Yep.
And that representation versus the 1970s animated version of her, versus the one in the 90s versus today are vastly different and very
Yes.
reflective of that time. So the witch in and I won't go into details of the 60s and 70s because that's not what we're talking about, but the her as a witch, and the media she was, or the audience that she was made for, um made this difference. You go from a trickster in the 60s that is more like a Marilyn Monroe character, and then you
Hmm.
have the 70s, she's kind of like a friend, and she was a CBS Sunday morning cartoon, Archie, in there she's very much, her sexuality is almost non-existent in that comparatively. um and then you get to the 90s where she becomes the girl, she becomes a witch next door. She becomes just the teenage girl. She fits into that idea of, she fits into the craft at the beginning. She fits into the younger, even she's even more witch next door than the ones in the craft. She doesn't have that
Hmm.
that harmed side to her. And she becomes similar to Charmed, similar to, the Willow character in Buffy the Vampire Slayer, Practical Magic. You can almost see her aging and becoming the practical magic witches, to some degree. She's that witch next door. She's your everyday witch. She goes into Target and buys the basic witch t-shirt that we all saw a few years ago, right? Um, it's a little fantasy. The ants are fun. You have that. That's what the 90s witches were. Of course,
And the
that
ants
was
even themselves had changed because in the earlier things they were still the monstrous witches, and now they're also the witches next door in the 90s.
exactly. And so but between the 1990s and today, modern witchcraft has changed. It's diversified. It's witchcraft is also reactionary to the world. And so we also see in this new version of Sabrina, she is representative of the things going on now. She's representative of the diversification of witchcraft. Witchcraft isn't one thing. She's representative of the fact that, and that is in the acceptance of there's satanic witches and various other types of witches. You see the diversity of representation of practice in the show, generally speaking. But you also have in the current one, the display, the challenging of morality and ethics and the breaking down of our understanding of boundaries. So in the 90s, witchcraft was good when it was cute and it looked like that Sabrina. There wasn't any evil in it, really. Here you have this breaking down, like I said earlier, I'm sorry, like I said earlier, you had witchcraft as bad and Wicca as good. Here you have this notion of what's good and bad in every character.
Hmm.
Something could be good, something could be bad. Sabrina makes some terrible mistakes and then has to backtrack. You also have the idea that Satanism could be a religion, and it's not all bad in this show. You have the good and the bad. I mean, you love the ants, right? But
Right.
they're part of the Satanic Temple. Not the Satanic Temple, but a
Yeah,
Satanic Temple.
clarification, clarification. Yep.
Yeah, clarification. Um, so there's this breaking down of boundaries of good and bad and a negotiation of what all that means that is very reminiscent of what we're going through in our world right now, which we're in a very difficult times. We're questioning a lot of stuff, and I'm talking outside of media. We're talking
Hmm.
about, our political scene is crazy, to say the
Yes.
least. And we went through a COVID and a pandemic that nobody's ever seen before in our lifetime. We've gone through a lot of tumult, and this show is really reflective of this kind of chaos, this cultural and social chaos that we're experiencing, especially for younger people. So that's the Sabrina of today.
Yeah, I love those insights, Heather. I think that that's super poignant. And one of the things I noticed, I had really conflicting feelings over the modern Sabrina. I loved it. I loved watching it. I loved the ants. I loved the story. I loved all of those things. But there was this real world component that really left me questioning and contemplating because it was so kind of pro Hail Satan. And that even became kind of popular after that show, right? Even amongst witches that are not satanic, right? They were like, oh, Hail Satan and loving Aunt Zelda and all of those things. And I was kind of like, wow, like what a departure, right? That we spent so much time and our elders spent so much time trying to make sure that we could distance ourselves from just being satanic. And now it's almost like this embrace of that a little bit. And then my wondering, like, yeah, in the 90s, we were in a much more stable time. And yet we might think the satanic panic is over. And I personally don't think that it is. I think you can still see it in Christian nationalism and all of the things that we're still facing today. And and so we're in this more unstable time, and yet people, we're kind of pushing that envelope a little bit, while the actual Satanic Temple was very upset that they used one of their icons in that show, right? They were like, "Do not
Yes.
put our symbols in this thing. This is not appropriate or safe. That is not our Satanism, basically, right? That is not our Satanism." And
It's
I
not.
just was so amazed. Um, sort of like the flip-flop of what had happened, right? Because here's the Satanist saying, don't equate us with this Satanism. And there's so many witches like, yeah, hail Satan, we love Sabrina. And they're not even really maybe satanic. And I just was like, wow, this is fascinating to me.
It is fascinating, and I think the it's not the satanic. There's so many things I could respond to in that insight. I think the Satanic Temple's main concern was the use of that statue with copyright infringement. So I don't think the show, and I don't know for sure. I don't believe that the show got permission to
They
use it.
didn't. They didn't.
Right.
That was the
And
big problem. Yeah.
I think that was the initial issue, but they are correct in that the Satanism that is expressed in the show is very different from what the Satanic Temple expresses. And
Very different.
you know, the Satanic Temple is a doesn't treat Satan as a deity.
Non-theistic.
There's
Yep.
yes. And yes, they're non-deists. And so it's a very different expression of what Satanism is. And so I understand that they don't want to be affiliated with it because it isn't them. So they weren't going to embrace it. They weren't going to say use it and use us because it's different. It would be like Christians wanting to,
Yeah.
you know, having a Jewish school and having Christians and saying, yeah, it's the same thing. No, it's not the same thing. Um, and there's a lot of Satanists today that are very much, even if they're affiliated with the Satanic Temple or not, that are non-deist as well. And
Yeah.
actually worked on a wonderful book called Magic at the Crossroads that just came out. That's all about that form. So Satanism in that form is very popular and becoming popular. And yes, during the Satanic Panic, people in the movement, the witchcraft movement, had to push back against it because that was the hammer, you know, that was coming down on occult practitioners of all kinds, tarot readers, psychics, all kinds, not just witches. So I
And
get
pun
that.
intended. Pun
Yeah,
intended. The
yeah,
hammer, right?
yeah,
Hammer of
that's
witches.
right. The
Pun,
witch
pun
hammer of the
intended.
witches.
Yeah.
So yeah, so that's a big difference today. That we can have a show that treats Satanism as a religion and then explores ethics and morality and culture and society within that universe. Um, and I think that was unlike no other.
And as
Um,
paradoxical as that seems, it's because of the 90's.
Yep. I mean, eventually, and to your point about the Satanic Panic not being over, I think the capitalized Satanic Panic is over. Um, that's not to say moral panics can't be revived. Satanic Panic was the fourth we've had in our history, in our American history, and I believe we are definitely seeing a panic um, within all of this other garbage. And it's almost like, and I wrote an article about this that's on Religion Unplugged a few years ago on how the Satanic Panic is being paralleled today in our culture. I think we're seeing remnants of multiple moral panics from our history all
Mm-hmm.
coming to a head here. We have the Red Scare panic from the 50s, you know,
Mm-hmm.
Russia, Russia, Russia. We have the Satanic Panic, remnants of that. Of course, everybody's you know, a Satanist. Everybody's a communist. You know, you have a number of these happening. I think the Crucible needs to be brought back to some extent to to
Yes.
remind us of the lessons of the very first of
Yes.
Satanic Panic, or I'm sorry, panic that we had on these shores.
Yeah, and you know, I was actually thinking about these panics. I love that you're bringing this up because associated with all of them, whether it's communism, Satanism, all these moral panics, who's associated with all of them? Witches. Even the communist ones. It was a witch hunt,
Yeah,
right?
there's
Like
always, yep.
always witches in all of these panics.
Yep, and that's why, you know, as I know the people that live in Salem and know Salem history dread talking about the Crucible because it isn't accurate, the play I'm talking about, but it is an allegory, and it is very, very important that this movie came out for the first time it was ever put on screen was 1996, which is remarkable because that was Miller's most produced play. And it was produced in
Yes.
1950 during the Red Scare, during that moral panic. For it not to be made into a cinematic triumph before 1996 is telling. And then for it to finally come to screen in 1996 at that watershed moment is significant.
Yes, absolutely. Well, Heather, we've talked a lot about all of the media, and we're going to continue to do so. But now I'm curious.
Mhm.
I've got a kind of a two-part question for you. What was it like? Were you a 90's witch? I think you were a 90's witch. Were you a 90's witch? And if you were, what media was your favorite or most impactful to you?
I actually started practicing in the early 90s. So yes, I was very much a 90s witch. The 90s are a generation that really speak to my heart in so many ways. Grunge music and
Yes.
flannels and all the good stuff from there, you know. Um, I think the craft was important to me, but I think it was less important to me as a practitioner than it has been to other people. I had been practicing for a few years and I enjoyed it and I love seeing it, but um, I'm, you know, I think more important than any single film, I think my book started in the 90s. The book that eventually was just recently published. The project started in the 90s. I was in film school throughout the 90s, grad school and undergrad. And I realized, and at that point, I really realized the connections between our mainstream and our popular movies and television and the cultural surroundings and how they were changing. And I applied this technique first to Disney animation and Disney animated
Mhm.
films, and it was just it had me hooked. And so by the late 90s, I noticed that which films were coming back. I
Mhm.
noticed the craft, and I was watching them all, of course, because
Yeah, yeah.
so I noticed, wait a minute, one after the other, the shows, Charmed, you know, all these things, and other ones we're not even mentioning. I I was going to actually, I started researching the book then. And since this is something, this means something. Why are witch films so popular again? Um, and then I put the whole thing away and life happened and I moved on. And then resurrected it back in 2012 or 13 or something when I realized which films were becoming popular again. So wait a second, I got to do it this time. And so
Hmm.
that's how. So the 90s is what birthed this book. The movement in the late 90s of the all this positive witchcraft stuff was was what birthed this book. And you know, for me personally, at the time, where was I? I had started practicing as a solitary out of the wonderful books that we had in existence then, um, you know, in college, like a lot of people. And
Yeah.
then by the mid 90s, I had joined a group and eventually practicing Wicca, and joined a Wiccan group and got a couple of initiations and had a family of witches and really got into the culture here in Metro Atlanta. So that's what I was doing. So I was studying film and also studying witchcraft and the occult and tarot all at the same time in the 90s.
That is awesome. What was it like for you studying witchcraft with a coven in the 90's? What was it like? Yeah, what was that like for you?
Um, it was eye-opening and inspiring. I think I found I came from a religious background that was pretty much secular.
Hmm.
I had some religious connections to through my family and everything like that, but largely we were mostly secular, so I didn't have to push back. I didn't have to hide anything. Um, and you know, I was searching through the early 90s through art and through philosophy and science for a spiritual path. And so finding the occult first, divination and tarot and astrology, and then eventually, you know, going to metaphysical stores in New York City, crystals, and just seeing how this I connect to all this was powerful. And then eventually, of course, you know, back in the 90s, there wasn't like internet groups like there are today on Facebook and other social medias. You opened up a little newspaper and found an ad. I found the little ad for a group looking for new students, and sure enough, I went there and have never turned back since. And
Wow.
it was invigorating. It was excellent. I found a family in my new home here in Atlanta, because I had just moved here. I finally found a spiritual journey to take. I don't
I love
like
that.
to say I found my spiritual home because I believe spirituality is a journey that you start somewhere and you keep going as you grow and change. So I like to say I finally found I took the first step on my spiritual journey. I found which path was for me to take that journey, and that was through down the occult path. And I found friends the first time I
Yeah.
found, witchy friends. So it was amazing.
I love that insight too about the spiritual journey versus the spiritual destination. And I really like that. And I think it's so applicable to magicians and occultists and witches, right? Because we're not supposed to necessarily just rest on our laurels. We continue to experiment. It is an experimental path and can also be a very devotional path. And I love in your story too, which I think is such a touchstone of 90s real witchcraft, is that strong community aspect,
Mhm.
right? That it was a community that you were moving into. Even if it was the coven itself was the community, maybe it wasn't the larger community in the area, but even then, that sense of community in my mind, or at least in my understanding of those who I've talked to, was just so much stronger in the 90s.
I think that's true to an extent. It's easy to bash the way things are now and say, oh, they were better, back in the day. But, in the 90s, the internet was just an infant.
Mhm.
I'm not talking about the historical internet and when it all started and who invented it and all that stuff. I'm talking about the usability and the mass usability and
Yes.
functionality of it to the rest of us. It really was the 90s that sort of brought digital media to a forefront, and we were all starting to enjoy it and the promises it had. So at that point, when I started, especially, we didn't have the opportunity to jump into a group online.
Hmm.
We were still to find community in the 90s, especially in the, early and mid 90s. You had to go out of your house,
Yes.
had to go to a coven stead. You had to go to a general meeting place, whether it was I don't know, a bar or a restaurant or wherever it was. You had to have community, you had to go out of your house and see people in person. And that's
Yes.
very different than meeting people online in a group, in a Zoom chat, in whatever it is the options have been since then. Back in that day, there was Usenet. So there were options to connect outside, but it was limited and they weren't really communities. It was more just message boards of people flaming each other, as we say now.
Yeah.
Um,
Yep. That's right. That's right. Yep.
so, but to have community, like I said, to find a witchcraft group to study with, I had to find an ad in a paper. We remember what those are? You get
Yeah.
them? I'm
Yep.
just
Yep.
kidding. So, that presents that was a very different world for us who are
Mhm.
coming up trying to find community then. We had books, we had newspapers, we had articles, we had to go to events. Um, and we had to meet people in person, in real life, as they say, IRL. That all internet changed everything, and I
Everything.
don't think it was all bad.
No, I
Uh,
don't either. Yeah.
but I think there's something very different about meeting people in person and having that in person um, connection, and then having people join over a group. And it's only gotten more digital since then, over the last couple of decades. And again, there's, for better or for worse, there are many
Yeah.
good things that have come across
Yeah.
about. So I'm not just poo-pooing it and saying I wish it was like that in the 90s, still like that in the 90s, but no, that's the way it was.
Well, and I like to say about it too, the internet and our technology today gives us so much more, but it doesn't replace some of the
Mm-mm.
things you can't replace.
I completely agree with that. I would urge people to still reach out and still
Yes.
meet in person, if they can. And I recognize there's some people that are unable to due to many different reasons. But if you can and have the resources and the ability and the time, meeting people in person, and not just in witchcraft, meeting people in person is so valuable. It's so real and so valuable. And I like to say, in the publicity world, when I used to do that work, is that kissing babies and shaking hands is worth 10,000 posts. Um,
100%, right? And it's exactly what we're also, I feel, discovering in our country right now in the USA is that it is important for us to meet in person, for neighborhoods to be connected, for
mhm,
communities to be resourceful with each other. These are important things that you just can't replace
mhm.
as truly valuable. I've been a part of groups that have met on Zoom for years, and none of us have almost met in person, maybe a few of us. And it does take that dedication, and there is real connection, there is real community, there is real friendship, and it doesn't replace people where I live, and it doesn't replace meeting them in person. When I have met some of them in person, it's just electrifying. It's a
It
whole
is.
new world, right? Even though I've known this person for years now, but when you meet them in person, uh, it's a whole other level of a magical experience for me.
Yep.
Yeah.
There's nothing like going to see practical magic in the theater with 10 witches wearing witch hats.
Nothing like that. Nothing like that.
And
I
I was
agree.
at in 1999, I went to the opening of Practical Magic with 10 witches wearing witch hats. And that is something that will stick in my mind forever. What fun was that?
I wish I could have been there with you. That does sound like fun. That does sound like fun. Heather, I'm curious now, if there is a piece, we'll change subjects a little bit and we can go back and talk about anything you want. But I am curious if there's like a unsung or overlooked piece of witchy media from the 90s that really sticks out to you
Hmm.
as um, either important or not talked about enough, or maybe just even your weird favorite.
That is so interesting. I did not prepare that at all. And I'm so it's my brain is just going to completely shut off on me now and
I
say, "Oh, the
understand. Yeah,
craft."
totally. That happens to me all the time. Yeah, I get it. I get it. I
No,
get
no,
it.
no, but there is one, and I'm gonna actually look up the name that I enjoy, and it's not really witchcrafty, and so it rarely ever gets talked about. I'm just gonna give me a second to look it up, the name of it. Okay. There's a movie called Dangerous Beauty.
Oh, okay. I've never heard of this movie. Okay.
I'm scanning since I have it open. Um, so there's a movie called Dangerous Beauty.
Okay.
It's not really a witchcraft film in what we're talking about, like The Craft or Charmed or stuff. It is a movie that is based on a courtesan from I think it's Venice of the 1600s, I want to say 1700s, who is accused of witchcraft and put on trial. So it's a period piece, and it's just fascinating to me in a different look at witchcraft accusation films. Um,
Okay.
I I can't say right now whether it's a top of the line film. I was fascinated with it. I was fascinated with it probably from an academic perspective, but it is another film that is demonstrating the moral panic and also the idea that witchcraft is used as a weapon against women who are powerful,
Hmm.
intelligent, and who try to have own their own self. It's not a message that usually comes out in the late 1990s in witchcraft films, as we've been talking about. So it's an anomaly, but it's a really interesting film. It's kind of like Dangerous Liaisons meets The Crucible, kind of meets
Cool.
Downton Abbey. It's got this
Yeah,
kind of
yeah,
like
cool. That sounds
it's
fun.
kind of like
Yeah.
this weird little and unfortunately dangerous. What I say, dangerous beauty is that she is a dangerous beauty because she's intelligent. She writes poetry. It's actually based on a real story from
Hmm.
Venice. So I like that one, but it has nothing. Like I said, it's totally an anomaly and doesn't relate to anything we've been talking about. But it's a witchcraft accusation film.
Fascinating. I wrote that down. I'm gonna have to watch that because I listened to your book on Audible. I listened to a lot of books audio, but even then I was like taking out my phone and like doing like voice notes, like watch this movie, like trying to like put things in there because I love the obscure witchy movies throughout the decades. I love them,
Well,
especially the obscure ones.
and we have to note. I mean, how big the swing was, we have to note that 1999, we have one of the most famous witchcraft films is the Blair Witch Project.
Oh
So
my gosh, how did I overlook the Blair Witch Project on my list? You're right.
yeah, so you're starting out with the witchcraft, and all of the satanic stuff and all of the witches like you brought up, and you end on the Blair Witch Project. And by that point, the Blair Witch Project is so famous and so popular that it changes witchcraft films for the next 5 and 6 years, and totally shifts everything. There's a merger and a change there, and mainly because of this popularity of the Blair Witch Project. And
Shifts it how? In what direction? I'm away from the next door witch, or like what? How does it shift?
so the next door witch and all of this stuff is it kind of peters out over the early 90s. You still have, obviously, Angel comes in, and you have a number of different, Charm lasts a little bit longer, Buffy, etc., into the 2000s. But what's as that's going down, as that's decreasing, you have an increase in what I would say is witch ghost films. That's what I call them.
Oh, yeah, yeah,
So
yeah.
because this is the end of the era of the witchcraft film, the beginning of really the popularity of paranormal. And Blair
Okay.
Witch Project sort of heralds that change. And of course, to capitalize on this change and the popularity of Blair Witch Project, a lot of those early ghost paranormal films are witch based. I mean, you can think of
Oh.
Paranorman, The Woods.
Paranorman, yeah.
Yeah, that's all happening. We get into this big paranormal phase. Supernatural starts, it just changes
Uh-huh.
everything. So the Halloween Town and all of the fun witchcraft stuff of the late 90s eventually decreases, and by 1995, Harry Potter and the Blair Witch Project have changed everything.
Wow, I had never even really connected those few things because I have to admit, and please no one skewer me for this, I didn't really like the Blair Witch Project or care about it very much. And so I kind of just really forgot about it. But, you saying that there was a sequel to the Blair Witch Project that also had a Wiccan in it,
Yes.
right? And so,
Yep.
like, there's also that sort of bridging that's going on there and that representation that's going on there.
Yep,
Um,
and just to add to that, that is that representation, that second movie, which was I did not like, is a indicative of the 90s, the influence of the 90s. So as I
yes.
said, by early 90s and into mid 90s, we start to see that dichotomy, that binary between Wicca and witchcraft, and that is picked up tremendously into the early 2000s, and the presence of that Wiccan woman in the second Blair Witch Project, the presence of a priestess, a Wiccan priestess, or which I don't remember. I think he's called a Wiccan priestess in the Blair Witch Project's secondary mockumentary that they make, that aired at the same time as the Blair Witch
Oh,
Project.
yes.
There's one in
Okay.
there too. And then you see a number of shows in the early 2000s and to 2005, 6, CSI, and I talk about this, Bones, all these shows are making that differentiation. They actually are having it. They're doing what the X-Files did in the 90s. They're doing it in the early 2000s. So it's the 90s that changed, it broke the bank, changed everything, and then allowed
Yeah.
for even the witchcraft representations in the 2000s that might be a little bit more um uh not connected to modern witchcraft, not positive representations. They're even making these changes. They've even made the adjustment, understanding that there are real Wiccans practicing a religion out there. And I love it when things like The Mentalist and all of those TV
Yep.
shows in the 90s go, oh, but wait, that's Wicca. That's not bad. They do this whole thing,
Yep.
and it's like, oh, here's our moment.
Yeah, our PR campaign is working. It's out there, right? They're giving our narrative. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and we have to thank the internet partly for that. And we
A
have,
hundred
definitely,
percent.
and also, organizations like Lady Liberty League and Circle Sanctuary, and I know Lady Lori Cabot had a rights organization in the 90s. So a lot of those guys were pushing hard. So we do have to tip our hats to all of that work that was being done, because that made all of the work and all of those representations in the 90s and then into the 2000s possible.
That's such an important point. This didn't just happen.
Mm-mm.
This didn't just happen because a bunch of people were practicing witchcraft. This happened because people stood up and
Mhm.
made themselves known and they found their voice and they created some level of institutional power to give that voice a platform and to protect other people. And I think it's really important for us to recognize that, I mean, however we feel about any sort of weird binary showing up in the 90s between Wicca good, witchcraft bad, or any of these other sort of things that we no longer maybe align with or resonate with today or think are accurate. Um, but it was vital not only for us as people and real practitioners, but to even get to where we are today and to even have any kind of real representation in media whatsoever. Back in the
Absolutely.
90s, even the early 90s, we talked about this in terms of movies, but you can see it in movies and in reality. In the early 90s, you couldn't be a witch because there was no such thing as witches. That was a fantasy creature.
Yep. Or it was a satanic practice, or it
Or it
was,
was a satanic practice, right?
yep,
But still, people would be like, you can't be a witch. That's not real. Magic's not real, right? It was a whole other conversation.
right.
Are you
Yep.
crazy? Are you crazy? You're a witch? What are you talking about, right?
Exactly. It was a very much, it was very dangerous for people to be a cult, or people just looked at you like you were, crazy, like you said, a nutbag. There was some interest in astrology in the 80s, and that was pretty safe. I think, Nancy Reagan and some other people. So there was some acceptance of baseline, sun sign stuff, Linda Goodman and all that. But
Yeah,
it was very dangerous. And I personally, I have some memory of the Satanic Panic to some degree. I definitely can admit to driving around a old tower in New Jersey backwards 3 times at midnight trying to evoke the devil, because that's what the kind of conversations people, that was reminiscent of the 80s and then into the 90s of trying to legend trip and occult stuff. So I know it existed, but I was too young and I was not practicing to feel the
right.
ramifications of it. But there were people that were harmed for real witches, or people that weren't witches.
Lost children, lost jobs, lost homes, lost
Yeah.
reputation, a number of things.
Yeah,
Yeah,
moral panics hurt everybody, not just
that's
the
right.
people they're aiming at. And so
That's right.
um by the 90s, the steps that were taken, like you said, these weren't, by our standards today, we look back and go, yeah, that's not good. Of course, because culture moves very slowly and it takes steps and it changes slowly. For good or bad, it changes slowly. And that 90s change of the acceptance of Wicca and the separation was was a big first step, a very big first step.
Yes.
Buckland's involvement in the 60s and all that stuff, those were other big steps. Are they perfect for us looking back? No. By today's standards, that's not okay, but by then it was a big step. So we've got to understand that evolution.
Yeah, and understand too, I find that this is a point that somehow gets swept under the rug a little bit, but also in the modern craft since Gerald Gardner and including Gerald Gardner, there was never an expectation that any of these people were supposed to be saints, gurus, perfect people, holy people, none of that, right? So like we can look back and see the imperfection, but there's really never been in truly and shouldn't be an expectation that these are like model people necessarily as much as and some of them were really great, but there wasn't a need for them to be model people as much as they took really important steps and even put their lives on the line to do so that we could be here talking about 90s witchcraft on the internet.
Live and in person, sort of.
Yeah, right. And
Yeah.
I think it's important to think about, the expectation was never that they were supposed to be perfect people.
No, no, I don't think that's the case, and I don't think that's a fair expectation of any of us to expect
Agreed.
us to be in what is perfect anyway. So,
Especially 50 years, 60 years, 100 years
yeah.
down the line, right?
Yeah,
Yeah,
and that's why in my studies, I always like to present context, because context is so essential to understanding cultural products, understanding the way people were expressing themselves, something that's progressive and forward thinking in 1930 was not progressive and forward thinking, back in the early part of the 19th century, sorry, the 20th century, excuse me, the idea of a woman being allowed to vote was forward thinking. And
Yep.
now most of us, most of us in this country don't take that for granted. It's not even a thought, so we have to understand context. And that's what I love with my studies with film and the way and that's what most interested me, is that context. Why does the
Hmm.
witch look the way she does at this period of time?
Hmm.
What is the context? And what does that mean? And what does that say about us as our culture? What does that say about us, our understanding of gender roles? What does that say about our ideas of beauty, women, etc.? So that's what excites me about this study that I did, and excited me, and why I did it, because that's it's about us as modern witchcraft practitioners and occult, as well as us as an American society as well.
Yes, I love that. And following from there, if you were to say, what is your opinion of how 90s media depictions of witches and witchcraft changed witchcraft, real witchcraft practice? How would you see the media as having changed the way people practice, and especially even if you could connect it to today?
Well, 90's, I think the big thing with 90's witchcraft is, again, that dichotomy. And I think that's probably the most influential on the modern witchcraft world, because I think at that point, especially the craft, again, that
Hmm.
watershed, having the presence of a Wiccan priestess, and it was known at the time that she did that, being so public, that this, I think, gave people already practicing like myself the courage to be a little bit more public, a
Hmm.
little bit less afraid. And I don't say that blanketly. I don't think everybody, all of a sudden the craft came out and there were witches on the streets, singing and dancing. That would have been wonderful, But I think just a little bit, even if it was just wearing a pentacle, even if it was just buying a couple more books, or whatever the case was for any individual, I think it gave people a little bit more of a space to start opening up. I think it also gave people language to use,
Hmm.
um, to further differentiate themselves um, without just saying, no, that's not us, that we're not Satanists. I think it evolved the language around witchcraft a little bit, because you could say Wicca now and people started to know what that was.
Yes.
Um, So I think that that is the main reason. And for young people who were searching for a spiritual
Hmm.
path, younger people than I was, teenagers, high school, middle school, who kind of were interested in it, they see the craft and they see these things and they start to imagine, I could be this. Now, clearly, some
Hmm.
of these things were fantasy based. Charmed obviously is fantasy based, but there was enough reality within these. There was enough embedded reality and conversations going on across these platforms to give them hope, to give them
Yes.
an idea. So I think it helped push. Did it make turn people into witches? I don't like to use that language. But I think inspired young people to search in for alternative paths of spirituality, and
Yes.
encouraged them just to search about who they were representationally, identity seeking, all of that stuff teenagers do. So I think it changed the language and created safe space for exploration,
Yes.
um, for would-be witches and witches that were already practicing.
Yeah, I love that insight. I think that's so accurate. And it makes me think of my love of Charmed. I didn't actually like Charmed all that much when it first came out when I was in high school. I thought it was okay, but I was like busy doing real witchcraft. And this was obviously very like, Aaron Spelling made for TV, everything's light and nice, witchcraft, right? Started going on
Yeah,
over there. And I liked that. I thought it was fascinating that even in the first episode, they're using words like Wicca, Athame, she's
just
that
enough,
just enough
just
that
enough.
first witch they depict is, I believe, using like a solar god invocation from Scott Cunningham when she's like lighting those candles on her altar,
Mhm.
and the spell to receive their powers is adapted from Doreen Valiente and is part of a spell and incantation that's still said in many circles and covens today, or at least the original one or further adaptations. And I didn't really fall in love with Charmed until I was really in my mid 20s, way out. I mean, I think it was after it even had finished. And part of why I fell in love with it, I think, is the original, maybe even intention of the show, is that I was so drawn by the idea of having a family that understood you.
Mhm.
and was magical and knew about how difficult it was to walk that line in the world sometimes. Like, take out all the fantasy elements, and quite frankly, it really did reflect my life, including in some of the weird conversations they had. I mean, like, if you're a witch, you're gonna have a weird conversation every once in a while, like, hey, did you take care of that ghost? Right, or something like that, right? And
Yeah,
so
yeah,
like,
yeah.
and so there were things in there that once I was older and wasn't there looking for the special effects or even the depiction of witchcraft, as much as to me it started to resonate on this level of belonging and family and community, and seeing the people, my friendships, my circles reflected in their conversations, at least in part on television, in a very normal way. And so I fell in love with Charmed then, and it's still one of my favorite shows now. I like to tease and say it's a terrible show that I love, because there's a lot of bad episodes. There really are, but I love it for what it is. Um,
I think that Buffy the Vampire, not Buffy the Vampire Slayer, excuse me, Sabrina of the 90s does this exact same thing. It's fantasy, but you have those weird conversations, and you can imagine what it would be like just to be in a house, a regular house where everybody practices witchcraft. And I think that's the celebratory moment. It's fantasy, yes, of course it's fantasy, but it's fun. And
yeah.
it celebrates witchcraft community. And Halloween Town does the same thing. I am not a
Yes.
fan of Halloween Town, but I know a ton of people are. But you have you have that's okay. You didn't like the Blair Witch Project or either.
Yeah.
So you have that sense of safe space of practicing magic. Yes, fantasy, but you have you have that space to imagine what if, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Heather, thank you so much for having this conversation with me today. I am so grateful to speak with you. And like we chatted a little bit before we got on the recording, there's part of me that feels like I created this podcast just to talk to you, because I loved your book so much, and I wanted to talk about witchy media with you, especially 90s witchy media, because it was just so central to my development as a person and as a witch. And it was I absorbed that. I ate it for breakfast, and I think you can see other people who also said something similar about even previous decades. I know Storm Fairy Wolf has talked about how Bewitched was his, pipeline basically of like witchy terms and understanding and places to go look for things, right? And so media is just so important, and I know it was to me, and I couldn't wait to talk to you about it. So thank you for being here.
Oh, thank you. I love the conversation and always happy to talk about the 90s and of course witchcraft films. So I'm so thrilled that you invited me. Thank you.
Oh, you're so welcome. And speaking of witchcraft films, I want to give you the opportunity to talk about your Witches Movie Coven.
Yeah, so every Wednesday at 9 o'clock Eastern time, a bunch of witches get online and have a nice little podcast meeting over a particular movie, not all 90s movies, of course. And we announce the movie a week before. You get a chance to watch it, and then it's a live conversation about whatever movie that we're doing. So join us Wednesdays. It's on YouTube. It streams on a number of platforms, and we have a live chat. So we respond to the chat. Those are also our coven mates, so you can join us. This week's movie, if I remember correctly, or I should say it's Friday. Next week's, you could cut that. Sorry about that. Um, so I can't say which movie is coming out. So you can,
Oh, okay. Yeah, yeah,
yeah,
yeah. Okay.
because I don't know when you're airing this, but you can join us 9 p.m. Every Wednesday for a fun movie thing, and just look on Facebook to find out what movie we're watching and watch the movie and join us.
Awesome. It's so much fun, y'all. You gotta go. You gotta go. It's so much fun. Well, thank you, Heather. Again, I really appreciate it. And thank you, everybody, for tuning into that 90s Witch. We will be seeing you all soon. Blessed be.